October 2002. The Washington, D.C. metropolitan area is known for its monuments, its politics, and its bustling, traffic-choked highways. It is the seat of American power, a place where history is written in the halls of Congress and the frantic pace of suburban life. But for 3 weeks, in the autumn of 2002, the region became known for something else entirely. It became a landscape of paralyzed fear, a testing ground for a new and terrifying form of urban terrorism that struck not at high-value targets, but at the very fabric of everyday existence. It was a time when the simple act of pumping gas became a game of Russian roulette, when mowing the lawn, walking to school, or loading groceries into a car carried the risk of sudden, silent death. This was the era of the Beltway Snipers. To understand the magnitude of this case, we must look beyond the headlines and into the intricate details of the investigation. This is a story of forensic breakthroughs, psychological warfare, tragic missteps, and the relentless pursuit of justice by a task force that grew to include federal agents, state police, and local officers from multiple jurisdictions. It is a study in how a single piece of evidence, a fingerprint thousands of miles away, unraveled a mystery that held millions of people hostage. The nightmare began on the evening of the 2nd of October 2002 in Montgomery County, Maryland, a quiet and affluent suburb north of Washington, D.C. At 5:20 p.m., a shot rang out through the window of a Michael's craft store in Aspen Hill. No one was hit, and at the time, it seemed like an isolated incident, perhaps a stray bullet or an act of vandalism. But less than an hour later, the true campaign of terror began. At 6:04 p.m., James Martin, a 5-year-old program analyst for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, was in the parking lot of a Shoppers Food warehouse in Wheaton, Maryland. He was simply going about his evening routine. A single shot was fired. Martin collapsed. By the time first responders arrived, there was nothing they could do. The projectile had been precise and fatal. At that moment, police treated it as a homicide, but they had no reason to suspect it was the opening salvo of a spree. The next morning, October 3, brought a level of violence that was unprecedented in its rapidity and randomness. It was a morning that would change the way the region lived. At 7:41 a.m., James Buchanan, a 39-year-old landscaper, was mowing the grass at a car dealership in Rockville, Maryland. The noise of the lawnmower shattered as a single shot ended his life. Before police could even secure that crime scene, the radio crackled again. At 8:12 a.m., just 30 minutes later, Prem Kumar Walekar, a 54-year-old taxi driver, was pumping gas at a mobile station in Aspen Hill. He was killed instantly. The pattern was emerging, but the speed was overwhelming. 35 minutes later, at 8:37 a.m., Sarah Ramos was sitting on a bench outside a post office in Silver Spring, reading a book. The sanctity of that quiet moment was violated by a single gunshot. She became the 4th victim in less than 24 hours. The chaos was absolute. Emergency lines were flooded. Police were racing from one scene to another, trying to find a connection, trying to find a suspect. Then, at 9:58 a.m., it happened again. Lori Ann Lewis Rivera was vacuuming her van at a Shell station in Kensington, Maryland, the 5th victim of the morning. In the span of roughly 2 hours, 5 people had been killed in public spaces within a few miles of each other. The randomness was the weapon. These victims had nothing in common. They were different ages, different races, different genders, and engaged in different activities. The only commonality was their location and the method of their death, a single, high-velocity round fired from a distance. Later that night, at 9:15 p.m., Pascal Charlotte, a 2-year-old carpenter, was walking down a street in Washington, D.C. when he was struck and killed. The sniper had crossed the district line. By the end of October 3, the region was in a state of shock. Law enforcement agencies from Montgomery County, the FBI, and the ATF formed a massive task force The initial forensic analysis of the recovered bullets confirmed the terrifying reality. The ballistics matched. The bullets were .223 caliber, a round typically used in hunting rifles or military-style semi-automatic weapons. They were all fired from the same barrel. There was one gun, and it was moving freely through the suburbs. As the investigation launched, a critical piece of misinformation took root. One that would arguably prolong the manhunt. Witnesses at the various scenes, in their panic and confusion, reported seeing a white box truck or a white van fleeing the area. In the chaotic aftermath of a shooting, the human mind searches for anomalies. White delivery trucks are ubiquitous in suburban environments. If you look for a white truck on a busy road, you will see one. This cognitive bias led investigators to focus intensely on white box trucks. Police stopped thousands of them. Roadblocks were set up, turning the Beltway into a parking lot, as officers searched every white van they could find. Meanwhile, the actual perpetrators were slipping through the net in a vehicle that no one was looking for. After the intense violence of October 3, the snipers changed their rhythm. They paused. The silence was almost as terrifying as the gunfire. The public waited, wondering where the next strike would be. It came on October 4. In Spotsylvania County, Virginia, Caroline Sewell was loading bags into her minivan at a Michael's craft store. She was shot, the bullet tearing through her. But miraculously, she survived. She was the first survivor, and her testimony would eventually become a piece of the puzzle, though she did not see the shooter. The location of the shooting was significant. The snipers had moved south, deep into Virginia. This was no longer just a Montgomery County problem. It was a regional crisis. The geographic spread stretched law enforcement resources thin and complicated the jurisdictional command. On October 7, the terror escalated when one 3-year-old Iran Brown was shot and wounded as he arrived at Benjamin Tasker Middle School in Bowie, Maryland. This shattered an unwritten rule of criminal engagement. Even among hardened criminals, children are often considered off-limits. By targeting a child at a school, the snipers sent a message that no one was safe. Nowhere was sacred. The psychological impact on the community was devastating. Schools went into code blue lockdowns. Recess was canceled. Parents were terrified to let their children walk to the bus stop. It was at this scene, in the woods near the school, that investigators found a crucial piece of physical evidence. It was a tarot card, the death card. On it, handwritten scrawls read, "Call me God." This was the first communication from the killers. It was a taunt, a glimpse into the ego and the delusion driving these attacks. However, the discovery of the tarot card was initially leaked to the press, causing friction between the police and the media. The killers, watching the news, knew their message had been received. The attacks continued with a cold, calculated rhythm. On October 9, Dean Myers was killed at a gas station in Manassas, Virginia. On October 11, Kenneth Bridges was killed at a gas station in Fredericksburg, Virginia. On October 14, Linda Franklin, an FBI intelligence analyst, was killed at a Home Depot in Falls Church, Virginia. The killing of Linda Franklin was a pivotal moment because she was an FBI employee. There was initial speculation that she might have been a targeted individual, but it soon became clear she was another random victim of opportunity. However, a witness at the Home Depot scene provided a description of a cream-colored van. This reinforced the white van theory, further entrenching the tunnel vision of the investigation. As the body count rose, the behavior of the public changed drastically. People developed survival strategies for mundane tasks. Gas stations hung blue tarps around the pumps to block sightlines. Drivers would crouch low behind their cars while refueling. Some would zigzag while walking from their cars to store entrances. The region was under a form of martial law imposed not by the government, but by the fear of an invisible marksman. Behind the scenes, the snipers were attempting to communicate. They were frustrated. They had left notes, they had made calls, but the chaotic nature of the investigation meant their messages were getting lost or ignored. They called the police hotline, but the operators, overwhelmed by thousands of tips, hung up on them. Finally, a breakthrough in communication occurred. The snipers left a long, rambling letter tacked to a tree near the Ponderosa Steakhouse in Ashland, Virginia, where 7-year-old Jeffrey Hopper had been shot and wounded on October 19. The letter was a demand for $10 million. It was an extortion plot, but buried within the angry, threatening text was a specific reference meant to prove their authenticity. The note mentioned a robbery in Montgomery, Alabama. This was the key that unlocked the entire case. Investigators immediately contacted the Montgomery, Alabama Police Department. They asked about any unsolved robberies or shootings in their jurisdiction. The Alabama police reported a liquor store robbery from September 21, during which 2 women were shot, one fatally. In the course of that investigation, the suspect had fled, but he had left something behind. At the scene of the Alabama shooting, the suspect had dropped a gun magazine while fleeing. Police there had processed it for evidence. They had lifted a fingerprint. This was the moment forensic science took center stage. The fingerprint from the Alabama liquor store was run through the national database. It didn't match a local criminal. It matched a young man who had been fingerprinted in Bellingham, Washington, for an immigration offense. His name was Lee Boyd Malvo. The task force now had a name. They dug into Malvo's background. They found that he had a close association with an older man, a former U.S. Army soldier named John Allen Muhammad. John Allen Muhammad was a trained marksman. He had served in the Gulf War. He was known to be bitter, estranged from his family, and increasingly erratic. The profile began to fit: a disciplined shooter, a younger accomplice, a motive rooted in anger and control. Federal agents began tracing the history of John Allen Muhammad. They discovered that he owned a vehicle. It wasn't a white box truck. It wasn't a cream-colored van. It was a 1990 blue Chevrolet Caprice. Suddenly, the thousands of tips about white vans were discarded. The bolo "Be on the Lookout" was updated. The entire law enforcement apparatus of the United States shifted its gaze to look for a blue Chevy Caprice with New Jersey license plates. The tragic irony was that police had stopped the Caprice multiple times during the 3-week spree. On October 3, just hours after the initial attacks, police in D.C. had stopped the car for a minor traffic check but let it go. On October 8, Baltimore police investigated the car because it was parked near a shooting scene, but the white van theory was so dominant that the officers didn't consider the sedan a suspect vehicle. The killers had been hiding in plain sight, camouflaged by the erroneous assumptions of the investigation. On the night of October 23, the break came from the public. A truck driver named Whitney Donahue was parked at a rest stop off Interstate 70 near Myersville, Maryland. He noticed a blue Chevy Caprice parked nearby. He recognized the description from the news reports he had been hearing all day. He called 911. State and federal tactical teams descended on the rest stop. They moved with absolute silence, sealing off the exits and surrounding the vehicle. It was the early hours of October 24. Inside the car, John Allen Muhammad and Lee Boyd Malvo were asleep. The arrest was executed flawlessly. The tactical teams smashed the windows and extracted the suspects before they could reach for any weapons. The reign of terror was over, but the subsequent search of the vehicle revealed the chilling ingenuity of their method. The Chevrolet Caprice was not just a getaway car. It was a mobile killing machine. The back seat had been modified. The panel between the trunk and the rear seat had been removed. A small firing port had been cut into the trunk lid, just above the license plate. The mechanics of the crimes became clear. Muhammad or Malvo would lie in the trunk of the car. The driver would position the vehicle at a strategic vantage point, a parking lot overlooking a gas station or a store entrance. The shooter, hidden completely from view, would aim through the small hole. This explained why witnesses never saw a gunman and why the sound of the shots was often difficult to locate. They were shooting from inside a mobile bunker. Inside the car, police found the Bushmaster XM-15 rifle. It was the weapon that matched the ballistics from all the shootings. They also found a digital voice recorder. a laptop, maps, and walkie-talkies. It was a kit designed for urban warfare. The legal proceedings that followed were complex and charged with emotion. Both the state of Maryland and the Commonwealth of Virginia wanted to prosecute. The Attorney General of the United States made the decision to try the suspects in Virginia first. The reasoning was strategic. Virginia's death penalty laws were more robust, and they allowed for the execution of juvenile offenders, a relevant factor for Malvo, who was 17 at the time of the crimes. The trials revealed the dark dynamic between the two men. John Allen Muhammad acted as his own attorney for part of his trial, a spectacle that allowed him to cross-examine the victims of his own terror. The prosecution painted him as the mastermind, a man who wanted to extort the government to fund a utopian society he planned to build in Canada, and who used the random shootings to cover up his plan to kill his ex-wife. The theory was that if he killed his ex-wife amidst a series of random shootings, the police would not focus on him as a suspect. Lee Boyd Malvo's defense team took a different approach. They argued the insanity by indoctrination defense. They portrayed Malvo as a child soldier, brainwashed by a charismatic and domineering father figure. They brought in psychologists to testify that Muhammad had systematically broken down Malvo's will, training him to be a weapon. Malvo himself would later describe the training regime, which included fasting, watching violent movies, and shooting practice, all designed to desensitize him to the act of killing. Despite the defense's efforts to mitigate Malvo's culpability based on his youth and manipulation, the jury found him guilty. However, they spared him the death penalty, sentencing him to life in prison without parole. John Allen Muhammad showed no remorse. He was convicted on all counts. In November 2009, 7 years after the attacks that paralyzed the region, he was executed by lethal injection at the Greensville Correctional Center in Virginia. The legacy of the Beltway Sniper case is profound. It changed the way law enforcement investigates serial shootings. It highlighted the critical importance of information sharing between jurisdictions. The National Integrated Ballistic Information Network, or NIBIN, saw increased investment and reliance, ensuring that a bullet fired in one state could be quickly linked to a gun in another. It also served as a harsh lesson in the reliability of eyewitness testimony. The white van phantom delayed the investigation and allowed the killers to continue their spree. It taught investigators to be wary of tunnel vision, to look at the evidence rather than the collective assumptions of the public. But the most enduring legacy belongs to the victims. 10 people lost their lives, and 3 others were critically wounded. They were not soldiers in a war, they were everyday people. James Martin, James Buchanan, Prem Kumar Walakar, Sarah Ramos, Lori Ann Lewis Rivera, Pascal Charlotte, Caroline Sewell, Iran Brown, Dean Myers, Kenneth Bridges, Linda Franklin, Jeffrey Hopper, and Conrad Johnson, the final victim, a bus driver shot on October 22. Their names remind us of the fragility of safety. The Beltway Sniper attacks demonstrated how a small group of individuals, armed with a common weapon and a desire to cause chaos, could bring the capital of the most powerful nation on earth to a standstill. Today, the memorial for the victims stands in the Brookside Gardens in Maryland, a quiet place of reflection far removed from the noise of the highways. It serves as a testament to resilience. The region eventually returned to normal. The tarps came down at the gas stations. Children returned to the playgrounds. But for those who lived through those 3 weeks in October 2002, the memory of the white vans, the police sirens, and the fear of the invisible threat remains vivid. As we look back on this case, we are left with a difficult question about the nature of justice and prevention. In a world where random acts of violence can be committed with such terrifying ease, how do we balance our freedom of movement with the need for security? And when the next threat emerges, hiding in plain sight, will we be able to see it before it's too late?